So this is a great story, right? It is, to me, right up there with the prodigal son as just one of those stories that encapsulates the whole gospel. If I were forced to pick a couple of stories, this is one of them. I literally have goosebumps from reading it again. That's not the first time I've read it today. It's just incredible. What I, even with my goosebumps, fail to kind of capture is that this story is funny. It doesn't seem funny. It's not funny that makes you laugh. It's funny that disarms someone and allows them to see truth. It's funny that breaks down a person's defenses and allows them to see truth. And I bet, if I had to guess, some of the other guests at dinner that night probably laughed, though it was rude. They probably laughed at Simon kind of being, well, taken to school is the only way I can I can think of it. He got schooled a little bit here, didn't he? It's a great moment that great teachers use humor. I'm teaching this class on Jesuit spirituality, and I've been looking at the writings of James Martin, who's a contemporary Jesuit, great priest. I think he did like a TED Talk or something. You might know him. He tells a story about a time in which he was really just beaten down because he had said yes to all these engagements, and he was getting really tired, and he just couldn't find a way out of his exhaustion. So he goes to his spiritual director and says, "This is what's going on. I'm exhausted, and I can't seem to find a way out." And the spiritual director could have chosen to have lectured him on one's choices and how he had put himself there, but instead he tells this great story. He says, "I know there was a man who would bring his bag lunch to work every day, and he would come into work and he would open up his bag lunch around lunchtime and he'd pull out a cheese sandwich, and he hates cheese sandwiches. So he would look at it in disgust every single time and just start to enter into this misery. But he had a very loving coworker, and the coworker would say, hey, I actually really like cheese sandwiches. It's clear to me that you don't. Why don't you take my turkey sandwich? We'll just trade out." And the guy would say, "No, this is my sandwich. I'm going to eat it." And he would just start to choke it down. So he does that one day, he comes back the next day, eats the cheese sandwich again in misery, and the coworker's like, "Man, you really should trade me," right? Third day comes along, and the guy pulls out his cheese sandwich, and he just is like green. That's what was going on in his soul as he... That's right. If I knew y'all a little bit better, I would have started dancing. That was dangerous, Lou. We're just going to keep going, right? So in his soul, he is just dejected at this cheese sandwich. And the coworker says, "Man, why don't you just tell your wife to stop making you cheese sandwiches?" And he looks at his coworker and he says, "I'm not married. I make my own lunch." The spiritual director could have spent hours telling Father Martin he was making his own problem. But humor allowed him to be confronted with it and changed. That's what's happening in our gospel story today. Jesus could have lectured like Sermon on the Mount style for a day about how forgiveness can transform lives, how great forgiveness can lead us to great demonstrations of love, and how understanding ourselves as forgiven is the key to putting love out into the world and being in a place to love God in return. And Simon wouldn't have gotten it, nor would the people sitting at table with him, and the disciples wouldn't have been able to carry it with them. It doesn't quite work that way. Sometimes it just takes a story like that to show us the power of forgiveness. Sometimes that's our story, and sometimes it's the story of someone else. When I was reading this week, I couldn't help but think back to one of these transformative stories of forgiveness that I knew growing up. It may have made its way down here because it was a sort of middle Georgia story, and Jacksonville is the capital of South Georgia, so it's possible that you heard it. It's the story of a guy named Billy Neal Moore. Does that ring a bell to anyone? Great, so I can tell it however I want. Good. Billy Neal Moore was in the Army and had come back from Vietnam, and he had a wife and a kid, and while he was gone, just try to find the sort of diplomatic way of saying these things. His wife started running with the wrong crowds and became a substance abuser, and was living with the dealer that she had. I'm trying to do like the earmuff version, right, for the kids. Was living with the dealer that was her supplier. And he came home to find that and have sole custody, basically, of his child while his wife was strung out. But while he was gone, his paychecks were going to her, and he couldn't get the army to switch that quickly so that he could have enough money to take care of his child. So he is desperate. And he talks to one of his friends from Macon, and his friend says, "Hey, I know a guy who is old and not really capable of defending himself, and he happens to have a lot of cash sitting around in his home. You're desperate for money. Why don't we break in and rob the guy?" And so they stay up late one night, and they drink a whole lot for the sake of liquid courage and go to rob this guy. And while fumbling around in the dark, there are a couple of different versions of the story. He either finds a gun, or the gun that he brings with him is on him, and the owner of the home has a gun. But there is a shot that's fired, and it's not Billy's gun that goes off first. In fear and in inebriation, he returns fire in the dark, and the bullet hits the owner of the home and kills him. And Billy is, of course, arrested the next day, but doesn't argue. He goes willingly. He goes before the judge. He pleads guilty. He confesses everything about it. And all he can do is beg forgiveness. And it is not granted. The judge says, this was a pretty expedient process back then. We'll give you 3 months. You'll be executed in 3 months. Of course, it's appealed, right? And so a year later, 7 years later, appeal. In this time, Billy Neal Moore is baptized as a Christian. A chaplain has come into the prison and explained to him that God has forgiven him for his past. And two things happen. And these two things happen anytime anyone is forgiven. His identity was restored, and he was able to reclaim a sense of the future, of hope, of what could happen next. His identity is restored not as inmate, not as murderer, but instead as beloved child of God, Billy, who is loved by God. And his understanding of, no matter how many days I have left to live, I have a purpose for my life that was given to me by God. I have a renewed sense of hope for tomorrow. So he begins to write letters to everyone that he's ever wronged and everyone that's ever wronged him. He begins to tell other people in prison about his forgiveness. And he starts to have this incredible impact on people. The ball keeps rolling. It sort of snowballs as he spends another year and another year and another year on death row. And I remember the story as I sort of picked it up in the early 90s as like a 12-year-old. At that time, the ball had rolled so much that when his final chance for clemency came, Jesse Jackson, John Paul II, all these people were writing letters to the court. Bono from U2 wrote a letter. And none of those mattered at all. What mattered is that the day that he was before a clemency board to beg for a stay in his execution, for a commuting of his sentence, a family member from the victim came to court. And they said, "There's no way you should know this or believe this, but let me tell you. He wrote a letter to us shortly after the events happened, and he asked us to forgive him. And we wrote him back and said, we know how much we've been forgiven for different sins, but by the same God. How could we not offer you forgiveness?" And he wrote back and he said, "Thank you." And we wrote back and we called him our brother. And we visited him in prison. It had been 20 years of an ongoing relationship, and they said, You can't execute Billy. Billy is our brother. And this family's already had one person killed. We don't need another one. The board adjourns. 30 minutes later, they return. First time in 140 years, they commute a sentence. And he is released from prison 7 years later. And you know what he does today? He goes back into prison to tell people about God's love and God's forgiveness. Because that love and that forgiveness does the exact same thing for him as it does for any one of us, that it happened to the same, in the same way for the woman at the table with Simon the Pharisee. It gave her an understanding of a life that was not going to be defined by somebody like Simon. Don't you know who she is? She's a sinner. Don't you know who Billy Neal Moore is? He's a murderer. Do you know who these people are? No, who they are is beloved child of God. She has no future. All she's ever going to be is a sinner. Billy Neal Moore is just going to be on death row until the day that they finally pull the switch. It would have been the electric chair. No. He's got an eternal future, one, but two, every day that he's alive is another chance for him to demonstrate his gratitude to God for God's forgiveness for all of us. That kind of internal transformation changes other folks' lives. Every person at that table that night with Simon the Pharisee would have been different, right? Would have been different because of what they saw. Her life became a demonstration of God's love. Her love was poured back out in gratitude because of her understanding of her identity and her restored hope for the future. When Billy Neal Moore was still in prison and still expected to die on death row, these churches in Atlanta and whatnot would have demonstrations, and they would be having worship services and writing letters and pleading for his forgiveness and the commuting of his sentence. And he would write to the pastors of these churches in Atlanta and say, "Don't you dare ask for my forgiveness, about which you have no control over, when you are judge, jury, and executioner for so many people in your life, and you won't extend forgiveness to them. Remember how much God's forgiven you, and go be a forgiving person before you write another letter asking me to be excused from my sentence." His life is dedicated to demonstrating the power of God's transforming love. When we understand how forgiven we are, whether we think we are somebody like Simon, and most of us aren't, whether we know that we are like this woman whose sins were notorious, though unnamed, and some of us are, most of us might be, when we find ourselves forgiven of whatever we think our rap sheet is, we are almost mandated to demonstrate our gratitude in love and forgiveness to others. Today in this story, we are asked to see ourselves at that table, to be, whether you think yourself Simon or the woman, it doesn't matter because the result is the same, to be someone who is confronted by the reflection of forgiveness in your own life. And because of our gratitude for that, to be able to go out today and demonstrate that love for others. When we look around in the world and we see a picture of a world that seems to be lacking in forgiveness and love, the direct correlation to that is how much we understand ourselves to be loved and forgiven. Hear that today. Know yourself to be one at that table with Jesus, and find out today in your prayer how you might go into the world and as wildly demonstrate love to others as this woman did to Jesus whom she adored. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.